unpause the recorder so that that's recording now. And I'm then going to move on to the final session of this marathon stint that we've had, which is following on the Andelin's session with their front end. And we are going to now look at some questions that have been sent. It does take us back to what we've already done in most cases. I will try and answer these questions as completely as possible. And hopefully, if there are any others, I'm going to have to use the chat box, but that might be a little difficult. So if you have asked a question and I haven't seen it, just unmute and interrupt me and say there's a question for you, because I don't have multiple screens that I can keep an eye on. So let's have a look at the first question. How do you pass a multiple key in the one field? This relates to the I/O server and a component key, a multi-field component key, and how does it all happen to be passed in one field? Now, what I'm going to do in answer to that is go back here, and what I did was I set up a little thing called a, what did I call it? I called it user app. It was just a little green screen app, and I'm going to use this to illustrate the various different things that happen. It's intended to demonstrate the use of an I/O server. So I'm going to be eventually writing some code or something into an I/O server. But you will see that these lines here are the parameter list for a particular I/O server that processes the customer master file. And in relation to the question, how does one pass a multiple key in the one field? The secret to that is the key field, or it's actually a key data structure, externally described data structure, and it's externally described customer master file, but only, and this is the important thing, only the key fields. That optional parameter there on the external name parameter means that this is actually a data structure that's created with one or more fields that make up the key of that file in the order in which they are defined in the file. So this is actually a data structure that contains one or more fields that do define the key of that file. Now that is what appears to be a single field. And when you come down to, let us, for example, say we're going to read it, CUSMST, if $ is the call to the I/O server, we're going to read it. In fact, I'm going to rather do some, yeah, I'm going to read it, sorry, let me just not. And I'm going to read it by key. And I want the record that I read placed into this data structure. Because this is the full record. You can see it's got external name cusmast F, externally described data structure, but it doesn't have the key parameter, which means that it's the full record for the customer master file. So I want to read a record, and I use the cusmst pointer because this record, the pointer is actually the address of this record. So when I pass the pointer through to the I/O server, it is actually a pointer to this record structure here that I'm passing through to the I/O server on this read. And then I need to also pass through the key that I want to read. And I can pass that key through as a single field, which is the name of the data structure, which is being expected by the I/O server, because the I/O server has exactly the same definition as this line. So it knows what it's expecting as a key. However, this is a data structure. I can also pass it as a variable of any type. And if I've got multiple fields, I can actually concatenate those fields together. So I can either pass it as a data structure, or I can pass it as a set of concatenated fields that make up all or part of the key. So that's where that little trick comes from, and it simplifies the process. The reason it is defined as a data structure and it's qualified is that I can populate it using the eval corresponding opcode. For example, that will actually populate one or more of the fields in the customer master file key from a record which is contained in here, or from any other record, from any other place in my application, as long as, and here I come back to my data dictionary issue, as long as the field names are the same and they have the same attributes, the eval corresponding will populate one data structure from another. And that makes it a very, very powerful tool. Now, I hope that's answered the question. How do you pass a multiple key? You're actually passing a data structure which can contain one or more fields. You must just be careful if your fields are numerics and you want to pass them as an expression, i.e. you want to concatenate them together. That's a lot more difficult, particularly if they happen to be binary fields. And it is much better when you've got numerics, unless they're zone numerics, as keys. It's better to use the data structure. Much simpler. You pass the whole data structure and it goes through in the right format. Okay, let's look at the next question. I've brought, these are almost associated in the same way. So the next question is, if you are doing a do-while loop on the pointers, do you use a returning indicator to signal end of file? Now, of course, all of this rather depends on how you write your I/O server. Answer to this question is yes, and I'm going to do a little bit of code. I'm writing the code. I'm not going to compile this because it's going to, I'm going to do a little bit of code to show you an example of how I would process this customer master file in a do loop. The I/O server, which I'm going to find here and bring up on the screen as well. You will notice that in the, I'm going to go to the read operation here. This is the I/O server. You've seen this and you've got the code for this. But get next is when I'm reading the next record in a loop. So if I'm doing a do while and I'm reading the record, what happens here is this does a return, including the end of file. And this I/O server, this procedure, returns that end of file indicator. And of course, it is returned from the I/O server. So when you're doing a read or read next, the actual procedure is a function and returns an indicator. The indicator varies depending on what you've asked the I/O server to do. If you've asked it to write it will return an indicator on if the record is successfully written. Of course, if the write fails, I will drop down to here and I will return an error message and not the indicator. So my IO server, if something goes wrong with the IO server, it will always be returning an error. So the on condition is for a successful write. The on condition is for a successful update. On condition is successful delete. Set lower limits, set S, returns the percentage equal, which indicates that the set lower limits found a matching record. So in the set lower limits, I'm returning the same indicator, the same Boolean indicator, but it actually is a percentage equal condition rather than a end of file indicator. So if I pop back to this one and let's assume I've chosen the customer master file, but unfortunately the customer master file has only got one key. Let's assume I have a file that's got two keys, like for example the invoice header. It's got customer number and invoice number, and I want to read all the invoices for a particular customer. The way I would do that as an example is this, and I would first do a in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to change this to sorry, as I say, I'm not on my normal keyboard or screen either. INV HDR FP. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to Control-V paste this across here. I'm creating another IO server. As I said to you before, you can put these in, if you're into copybooks, you can certainly put them into copybooks. There's no argument about that. So what I've done is I've created a process now. This is going to be a tricky one because it's got to be to there. Right. You can create, each IO server can be a copybook statement because these are pretty much standard in terms of structure. Here, what I would do is I would create, for example, INV HDRFK, which is the key, dot no. So I'm putting the customer number So what I'm doing there is I'm actually populating the header file key with the customer number from the customer master record that I've just read. Seems logical to me anyway. Then what I want to do is I want to actually set lower limits on the invoice header file. So I would do that simply by calling the IO server with S1, which because I only want to set the lower limits for the first of the two keys. I then want to provide the pointer to the record where the record that I'm checking, sorry, doesn't is going to be placed, and I'm going to use the key, which I populated with the customer here. Now, because there are two fields in this key, it doesn't matter, because I'm actually only, because of the S1, I'm actually only looking at the first key, so the second key is irrelevant. Also, in the set lower limits here, I don't need that pointer because the set lower limits doesn't return a record. It simply positions the pointer and confirms whether or not you have had a record. So I can use this as a function by saying if not invoice header, that will tell me that I did not find any invoices where the customer number matched the one in the key, because it's a Boolean indicator which uses the percentage equal as a return value. So I could do that, and then of course I would have an end if, which would be processing further because I hadn't got any invoices at all. If there was a record in the file, that indicator or that Boolean indicator would be on because the percentage equal would be on, and that means I find one record with the customer in the invoice file. I could then continue further processing by using header if dollar again, same call, but this time I'm going to use the read next requirement because the S1 has positioned the pointer onto the record that is due for reading, and read next reads the current record at the current pointer position. I then have to specify the pointer because this read is going to return a record, and it must return a record into that record structure which is addressed by that pointer. So this will return the record. In this particular case, I do not use the key because I want to use the partial key that was established on the previous call. So I would do that. Now here, I would now use the Boolean indicator that will return me an end of file condition by saying do while not, i.e. do while I do not have an end of file indicator returned. And this would be something I would do some processing of the invoice, then I would do an end do, and this would then carry. I missed that. I didn't hit the right button. Right. Now that is the code based on my current style of I/O server, which returns an indicator for either end of file or equal condition or whatever. That is the sort of code that I would use in my application to read a customer record, use that customer number, and read all the invoices that belong to that customer and process those invoices. So that's an example of how that would work. Okay, let me just see, have I got anybody in my chat box? No. So we're all with me. Nobody's left, so I'm quite happy with that. So that's the example which essentially, I believe, offers the answer to that second question. What I'm going to do is I will attach this particular piece of source code to the meeting files so that you will be able to pull it out. I'm going to leave you with a piece of source code that's not going to be compilable, unfortunately, because I'm going to write a lot more of bits and pieces into that same piece of code. But at least it'll give you an idea of how one handles these things. Next question. Can you go back through the data structure used for the pointers and why? I think, and this has come from Kay, and I'm just wondering, this was why I did this exercise, I'm wondering, Kay, whether in fact this has answered your question to your satisfaction, or would you like me to do it in a bit more detail? Oh, okay, so Kay's happy with that answer. So in fact, that last question is basically related to the first question. Right, next lot of questions. Is there a limit to the number of open data paths that a job can have, and is it tied to the PAG and amount of available resources for the job? Okay. This is internal work management of the IBM I. Answer, there is no limit to the number of open data paths that a job can have. It is tied to the PAG in that every file you open, its open data path is added to the job's PAG. A job is not limited in terms of resources, but obviously your entire system is limited in terms of its memory resources. And as a result, if your PAG gets so big that it cannot fit in available memory, what starts happening is that the operating system starts swapping PAGs in and out of memory in order to make space for your job's PAG, because the PAG for your job has to be in memory before that job can execute. And if too many jobs have too many open data paths and the PAGs are too big and you're a bit constrained on memory, what starts happening is that the operating system is swapping PAGs in and out of memory continuously, so that it actually doesn't have any time to execute any job instructions. This is known as thrashing, and your machine comes to a grinding halt. So although there's no specific limit, the whole idea and to gain maximum performance and maximize the utilization of the memory that you have on the machine is to reduce the number of open data paths. And that is what this whole idea of a single I/O server that can be used by any program within a job is all about. Of course, once you move out of an activation group into another activation group, you actually effectively start another PAG. It's not another PAG, it's an extension of the PAG, but it's an extension for that activation group. And if you open the same data path there, you actually get two instances. So caution as to how many you open is always a good thing. Now, as you modernize, you will find that you need to open fewer and fewer and fewer files, strangely enough, because your objects are smaller and smaller. There, as I said, there is no limit. What will happen is as your various different jobs build up PAG size by opening file after file after file after file, your whole system will slow down. And it will get slower and slower and slower and slower until it really is not doing anything. Okay. Ouch. Kay has just said that she has one job on her system that's got 4,500 open data paths. That's pretty good. I think that's got to be close to my record. You need to do something about that. That really does need, you don't need that many. There's no ways that you need that many. But that, of course, is a process for rationalization, normalization, and fragmentation of your application into a much more manageable, smaller components. Right, let's move on. Okay, well, that goes back to the previous question. I think your 4,500 is a new record. Average number of ODPs, 30, 40, 50, 60, they don't cause problems. I've never seen, 700 ODPs I think was the most I've ever seen. And if you've got enough memory on your machine, now in the old days when memory was very expensive, we used to be a bit tight on memory. You used to see performance issues. These days memory is a lot cheaper. Because of the way the architecture is structured, you can move memory backwards and forwards. So if you have a memory-rich environment, your ODPs can exceed, probably exceed 100, 200 before it starts creating problems. Remember something, though, that let us assume you have a order processing system. I choose order processing because it's usually the most resource-intensive application in any business. And if you have one person, and that one person opens up the order processing system, and that order processing system opens up, say, 500 open data paths, it's not a problem. Then you get a second user coming in and opening up another 500 open data paths. Then you get 3, 4, 5, 6, 20, 50, 20, 30 of your staff. You might have a call center, an order-taking call center, which might be manned by 30 people, and they're all opening the same application, but in different jobs. Each one of those jobs requires 500 open data paths. Now you get a multiplication of scale that can actually bring your machine to its knees. So one must not only be aware of individual applications and individual jobs, but you must be aware of how many iterations of the same job are going to be present on average on your system. I have a golden rule that solves all my problems. Make your PAG as small as possible for everything that you write. If you do that, you can't go wrong, and nothing will break. But that's the trick. Don't program for efficiency just when it's absolutely essential. Make it a habit of programming for efficiency all the time. Right. There's only one way of checking to see how many open data paths you've got, and you can do that only from inside the job that is running. Or, actually I lie, you can also check it from another job as long as you know the job name of the job you want to check. I have read one article on using a custom QA/QQ-INI file to cap the open data paths. QA/QQ-INI is a parameter data file for SQL only. So if you're in a DDS database, that doesn't help you either. So QA/QQ-INI could be useful if you are using SQL to open your data paths, and you can cap them. But, of course, if you hit the cap, your application crashes. So it's really never a good idea to do that. And I agree with Kay in the way she's worded this. I'd much rather we control properly via activation groups and in the programs, correct. So it's all essential for a design issue. I'm just going to show you how you can You can use the DSP job, display job, and you can select OP and F as a parameter. Now the star at the top indicates this job, current job. However, if I know the job name, user, and number, I can check the number of open files on any job. And by looking at that, you can see that my current job has 2 open data paths. So you can also do F11, and you can see how many IOs have occurred on those files and what activation group scoping you've got, and so on and so forth. This display job command is a CL command, but it does have a matching API, which means that you can actually do this type of checking from inside an RPG program. You would first of all have to look and find the API that gives you a list of all active jobs, and then that will give you the identifiers for all active jobs, and then you would use this display job command or API to display how many open data paths there are in each of the jobs. And also, of course, they show you, if you take note, it shows you which file. Now, what you're looking for here really, file and library, what you're looking for here really is how many files with the same name from the same library are open in the same job at the same time. Because that's data path redundancy. It means you've got 2 data paths for the same file, and that's a waste. You need to eliminate that as well. Okay, so yes, there is a way to check, but the best way to manage this sort of thing is from the original design point. You know, when you're designing an application, you know what it has to do, you know what files it has to read. And really, don't get excited if you've got 20 or 30 open data paths. That's nothing, as long as you've got a reasonable amount of memory on the machine, which most people do these days. But you still need to be aware of it during the design phase so that it doesn't get out of hand. Okay, so those are open data paths in jobs. Remember, each job has its own tag, which contains its own set of open data paths. So you've also got to think about how many times this job must be running or is going to be running in the system. I'd like to point out at this point in time a rather amusing anomaly that occurs. Most people have this opinion that if I have an order entry job and I've got one person using that job and they have a certain response time from the system based on all their requirements, etc. And the assumption naturally is that as I add users to the same job, i.e. the first person logs in and then the second and the third and the fourth up to the 10th person, one automatically assumes that the job will go slower and slower and slower because there's contention for the resources, the program resources, the file resources. But an odd thing happens with the IBM I. If you have enough memory, the more users you have on a particular job, the faster the system goes. Now, I've had people argue with me about this, and I've actually had to document it and prove it, but it's true. And the reason is that the basic fundamental underlying design of the operating system of the IBM I is that it is designed for re-entrant use, i.e. the programs are all re-entrant. What this means is that the program, the page of program that is in the memory, doesn't have any variables in it. The variables are all in the PAG. So a page of program in memory is common to all jobs. and can be used by all the jobs using that piece of program code, that page of program code. Now, obviously, if there's not enough memory, IBMI caches everything it can, i.e., if it brings something into memory, it's going to keep it in memory for as long as is possible. And that includes file blocks, program pages, and all sorts of other resources are kept in memory for as long as possible. When the system decides that it needs to swap something out of memory to bring something new in, it will always swap out the least used page of memory. The earliest least used page of memory will be swapped out in it, replacing it with a new one. So if I have one user using a particular program page, that could get swapped out quite easily because they're only hitting it, I don't know, every 10, 20 seconds, whatever it happens to be. However, if I've got 30 people using the same program and the same pages in the same program, they are much more frequently hit, and as a result, they're less likely to be swapped out, which means they will then remain memory resident, and the more people using the job, the faster the job runs. It's a contradiction in terms, I know, but it is actually a fact. It's just a little bit of an interesting aside. Right, let's have a look at the next one. How to handle file record locks. This, because of the issue, I'm going to bring up the second question here as well. Because the record locks around a record and how to handle them and look after them and make sure you don't get yourself into trouble. Record locks are handled in the methodology that I've been proposing through IO servers and triggers and all of that sort of thing, exactly the same way as they are handled, as they have been handled in your applications currently. If you read a record for update, it will be locked until you either update it or you read another record from the same file. That is the norm for record locking. Totally the norm for record locking. Except with a normalized relational database, you are required to put your files under commitment control. And that basic rule changes slightly. A record is locked if it's read for update. It is released if you do not update it and you read another record for update, the original lock is released. However, if you update that record, then the lock is maintained on that record until you commit the change. So when commitment control is active, which it should be in all normalized DB2 databases, your situation is that a lock could be retained on the record for much longer than it is at the present time, because you are updating. Remember, you've normalized the data, you have smaller but more files. Your transaction update occurs across numerous files, and all of those records that you update across a single transaction are maintained, locked after update, until your application is satisfied that the transaction is complete. Then your application will issue the commit statement, and at that point, all the locks will be released, and those records will then be available for use by other applications. You may come across an error message that says this record is locked to its own job. This can happen if you update a record under commitment control in one part of the application, and then you attempt in a trigger or another part of the job, you attempt to actually update that record again a second time within the same commit cycle. You will get that error message which says this record is already locked to this job. But it's an odd one. It doesn't come up very often. And you need to know that you are looking for a situation where you're attempting to update the same record twice in different parts of the job. Okay, so your record locks are handled in exactly the same way. And I have found very, very few problems using triggers and IO servers. I've found very few problems with record locks. The golden rule here is when your application has finished processing a transaction, issue the commit statement. That's it. Then that transaction is closed, released, and the locks are all let go. And that's the standard rule. Okay. What have we got, Ned? Okay. I'm very glad this was asked. I forgot to mention it when I was talking about triggers, and I'm very glad that I was prompted with this one. Cascade deletes. This is a referential constraint from a foreign key file or a dependent file, connecting it to a parent file so that there's a referential relationship between the two. And you can specify on the dependent file that you want cascade deletes, which means if you delete the parent, you automatically delete all the dependents. And that can be a huge number of records across a vast tree-like hierarchy, depending on how you've constructed your database. But, and this is the one rule within this whole database that I sort of understand, and I wish it wasn't like that, but it is. If you have a cascade delete defined in a relationship, you cannot put the before or after delete triggers on the dependent file, i.e. you can't have an after delete trigger on a dependent file that has a cascade relationship with the parent. There is, I dug around, and there is a reason for it. I wish there wasn't, but there unfortunately is a reason for it. And it does tend to restrict one when you are designing this process. I know where this question comes from because I have dealt with this often. The need to actually take a deleted record, or in fact to take any record and move it into an archive file or a history file or an audit file, take it out of your production database and put it away in an archive file is always excellent practice. There's no question about it. To keep on a file 200 or 700 or 1 billion records of old data that are never used, and you're backing them up every day, and they are extending the size of the PAG and the size of the index, and they're overloading the system, is not a good idea. When you have a file that you want to delete a record from because that record is no longer needed, but you want to move it into another file for archive purposes, unfortunately, you can't do it with a cascade delete and an after delete trigger. It doesn't work. There are numerous other techniques for achieving exactly the same result. Like, for example, you can have no cascade delete, but you can have an after trigger that writes a copy of that record into the archive file. And then you can process that archive file in the background, and you can delete records from that are in the archive file. You can delete records from your production file as a background job. That's one method. There are many others, which One can design to suit the requirements that you need in your application. But what you can't have is you can't have a after delete or before delete trigger if you have files related by cascade deletes. Sorry about that. Right. Should we use CLLE programs now instead of CLP programs? What's the difference? Well, the difference between CLP and CLLE is exactly the same between RPG and RPG ILE. CLLE is the ILE equivalent of CLP. So I would say, without a shadow of doubt, stop writing CLP and write instead CLLE. It's exactly the same. You get more function, you get the integrated language environment capabilities, you have activation groups, and you have all of those things. Of course, if you want my real true advice, stop writing CL altogether. I only write CL when I want to create customized compilers for my complex service programs. Other than that, I don't write CL at all, because RPG, using the API called qcommand_exec, can execute any CL command from within inside an RPG program. And if you want to execute commands that return values, you will find there's an API that does that instead. So actually, you can drop your CL altogether, except as a simple method of documenting a complex compile. Now, I know that a lot of people won't agree with that. They're familiar with CL. To be absolutely honest with you, I don't think I've written even the simplest CL program. I haven't written one in 20 years. And I haven't found it to be anything of a problem at all, because most of this you can do in RPG without a problem. Okay. I hope I'm doing okay. Right. Can a parallel DLL can have a unique key while the DDS does not? Now, I'm assuming, I had to make a bit of an assumption on this question. Is there somebody who wants to say something? No? I had to make a bit of an assumption here. But what I assumed was that, in fact, we'd taken a DDS file and converted it to a DLL file, and at the same time, because we had to create a unique key in order to make the DDL, we had a DDS in one library and a DDL in another library, and the DDL has a unique key and the DDS does not. And that's the assumption I made here. Obviously, this is when we are migrating from the DDS to the DDL. I do not see that one should keep two files of the same name. In fact, AO won't allow you to do that. A DDL and a DDS can have the same name. They can exist, but they can't be different files as such. It's not a good idea. The answer, however, to the question is whether a DDL and a DDS have a unique key or not. The level ID remains the same. Because a key, and just listen to me very carefully here, because this can actually confuse people quite a lot. A key does not change the level ID of a file. I can have a file, I can create a file with no key. I can then add a key. I can then change the key and add more fields to the key, and all of those combinations will give me the same level ID. The key has no impact on the level ID. In fact, no primary key constraint, no unique key constraint, no referential constraint or check constraint affects the level ID in any way. The level ID of a file is affected by the following. record format name will give you a different level ID. More or fewer fields in the record will change the level ID. A different sequence of fields in the file will change the level ID. And different attributes, and I'm talking about length and data type, will give you a different level ID. And strangely enough, the default will change your level ID. Those are the things that affect the level ID. Keys do not. So I hope that is the answer to the question. If any of these questions are not answered satisfactorily, please throw something into the chat box so that I can pick it up and back it up later. Thank you. Okay. Okay, this question, as you can see, came from Everett. They are busy working. I know they're busy working on their dictionary. And the answer is you don't. You don't promote a dictionary. A dictionary exists as one instance of a name, and it applies to all files in all environments across your entire enterprise if you choose to set it up in that way. So if you have sanitized your warehouse dictionary and now you want to put it onto your main Everett dictionary, that's going to be a bit tricky, and that we will have to take offline and discuss it, because you can't even just copy the records from the one dictionary into another dictionary, because you may create duplicates which won't give you the right sequence numbers and which will mess up all your sanitization. So we're going to have to discuss this one, and I suggest we will take this offline as soon as possible. Okay, but there is only one instance of a dictionary, and it services all development, all test levels, and production through the entire enterprise if you choose to set up your enterprise that way. And that is what should be done. That is the correct way, because then you have a dictionary that is enforcing consistency across the entire application. Okay. Yes, there is. I don't know whether that was too quick for you. Is there a way to import one file to a schema that is already in AO? And as I said, the answer is yes. And I will go into the database environments. Well, if you open the workbench, you've got a list of files. And if you click on one file, you have an import option, which will allow you to import a file from any system schema file name to any other system schema file name. What it does is it goes into the file library designated on the left-hand side of this screen, and it will import from the library into the AO metadata nominated on that side of the screen. So you can import a file from a schema into AO. Either a different AO, you can actually import it as a different file name as well, if you wish to do so. It's to allow flexibility. You can make quick copies of a file from another schema into the schema. However, both schemas must be registered within AO for this to work. Okay, so that answers that question. Is there a way to convert one file to DDL from DDS in a schema without converting all the others? The answer to that is also, I'm pleased to say, yes. If you look at this menu, you will see I'm in the workbench. There's the database workbench. I have CusBalF open. And okay, in this particular case, it's a DDL file. Let me back out of here. I'm going to go to the other library, which is the Averett library. Open the workbench. And I'm going to pick, this is a DDS file. I can use this recreate option. And the basic rule with AO is that AO will always create the file, a physical table, that is a DDS file. AO will always create it as a DDL if it is possible to do so. Now, that is the big if it's possible to do so. I'm just going to open this and I'm going to show the keys. This one, because it's keyed unique, I think we made this keyed unique, will convert to DDL unless there's any other reason for it not to. This one here will not convert to DDL because it's a keyed not unique. So if AO determines that I can't convert it to DDL, I will recreate it as DDS. But if all of the requirements for DDL are satisfied, then I will create it as a DDL and not as a DDS. So that's something one must remember, that AO is always trying to move you into the DDL environment, because that's where you're going anyway. And if you want to recreate a file, then of course it will recreate the DDS as a DDL if it is possible to do so. And in doing that, of course, it will also increase the page size to a 64K page size. So you will have a DDL physical table. If we are talking about logical files, that's a slightly different matter. A logical file, this is a DDS view, will always create as the view as whatever it's defined as. So if this is a DDS view and you recreate it, it'll create as a DDS view. If you wish to create a DDL file, then you're going to have to create a new file, because there's no equivalent DDS to DDL relationship. So I would say once you decide to modernize, all new logical files can be recreated as DDL if it's appropriate. Remember, if you create a DDS view, it will be compiled at a 64K page size. So it will be compiled as a bigger page size, which means, of course, it will be more efficient, but it will still remain a DDS. It can't convert it to a DDL because the level ID would change. We've explained that. Okay. So, yes, there is a way to convert one file to DDL from DDS. You just simply pick up your DDS file, make sure you've satisfied all the DDL requirements, and then recreate the file. And it will be recreated as a DDL. And the source that is generated will be DDL source. Okay. How many more we got? Okay, how to send a message to the user in the application program that the record has changed. This was a little bit strange to me because none of the applications I have ever written has ever notified the user that the record that they have changed has actually changed. what my applications has always done is to tell the user when the change that they have attempted didn't work. So the assumption is that the record's changed unless I tell you otherwise. If you wish to do this type of thing, it's easy enough to do. Your I/O server can simply return to its caller a diagnostic message saying record has changed. And then it's up to your application to pick up that diagnostic message and present it to the user. You could also add a parameter to your I/O server or an indicator to your I/O server, because if we look at the next question, I'm not sure what a prototype parameter could be, but yes, you could put a extra parameter onto your I/O server that would send back an indicator as to whether the record's been added, deleted, or changed. And then your application program could deal with it accordingly. In AO, all the screens that you see in AO, these are all driven by User Interface Manager. And so if I sent a message back from my I/O server to the caller, that caller would be the User Interface Manager, and any diagnostic messages it received would automatically be put along the bottom line. So using User Interface Manager would make the job very easy. I just send a diagnostic message back again. However, if you're using 5250, or if you're moving towards the one-point portal solution, then one would need to deal with these error messages in a slightly different manner. But I tend not to tell people it's changed. I usually tell them that it didn't change because they made a mistake and point out which field the mistake was found on. I think this was Dick. Is that a satisfactory answer, Dick?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
I haven't done it in years either. This came from a question from another programmer.
Okay. Yeah. As I said, I tend not to be obvious. I tend to rather work on the negative, that if it didn't work, I'll tell you about it.
Right.
Okay. Thanks, Dick.
Yep.
Right. Okay. This was a question which has a two-part answer. First of all, it's not possible to call an I/O server program from the command line, because you can't provide it with a system pointer that addresses a space into which that I/O server's got to place the record, because from the command line, you do not have a space into which the I/O server can place the record. So you can't specify the pointer that the I/O server needs in order to place the record. So you cannot run an I/O server program from the command line. That actually wasn't an accident. That was deliberate, because I don't need people using my I/O servers, which the trigger allows people to use. I don't need them using it from the command line. So having said that, why are we getting the message that commitment control has to be started for a file that is journaled? It's actually not that commitment control has to be started for a file that is journaled. Remember, in your I/O server, the F-spec in your I/O server has got the commit keyword. Let's find it. There it is there. It's got the commit keyword on the F-spec, i.e. all I/O servers put the file under commitment control. And because that file is under commitment control, your application needs to start commitment control before it calls that I/O server. Because you can't open a file, which is what the I/O server does, which is under commitment control, if your application hasn't started commitment control for that specific activation group. So that is the reason. Of course, files under commitment control need to be journaled, because otherwise commitment control doesn't work if the file is not journaled. So journaling and commitment control go hand in hand, and your application has to start commitment control to activate the entire commitment control infrastructure before you can process a file that's under commitment control. So that's the reason for the message. Okay. And this is the last one. Can I show you what naming conventions I use for my programs and files, not for the session database you are using for the classes? Yes, I can. And I'm going to show you the AO standards, naming standards for the conventions. I'm going to do it work obj pdm, and I'm going to use the AO. Let's do the files first. AO underbar db underbar b, which is my production database. And I'm going to just look for all the files. Keep missing the keys. Right. I use 3 letters as a mnemonic, as a prefix for groups of files. In our example for this training, I've used CUS, INV, PRD, REP. These all group the files into their different logical categories across the entire enterprise. In my case, I have AOF, I have some AOLs, and I have some MSGs. These are grouping files according to their behavior, their logical groupings. Then, mostly, was Kendall at the meeting? I don't know how Kendall managed to, he's camping. Then I used another 3, and mostly these are numbers. Now, I've had lots of long-winded discussions about these numbers. The most common objection to these numbers is, how can you remember what a number means? It's meaningless. You need to have something that tells you what's in the file. Let me tell you, I know what every number in the entire AO database means. The advantage of having numbers is I can organize my files. I start with 0, 0, 0 usually, then I go to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and I go up in tens. But you will notice there are some that are 31, 41, because there's 111, 112, 113, 14, 15, because I want to be able to fit new files in a logical sequence and keep my database in some sort of a logical order. My numbers tend to reflect my referential constraints. The lower the number, the more likely it is to be a parent. The higher the number, the more likely it is to be a dependent. There are groups within here. All the files that start with 0 have a particular, they are control files, management files, group files. All my files that start with a 1 are to do with the definition of files in the database. The actual database metadata. Then you will see there are some 2s. The 2s are pretty much the cross-check, and 3s are dictionary. So I have a number there that tends to indicate what group. There's 300s, 400s are the promotion function files that are needed, and so on. So I have 3 numbers following the prefix, which group my files for me. And because I use RDI, they're all in the same source file. They all fall nicely into sequence, exactly as I like them to be. Of course, physical files end with an F, which is how you spell physical. F-I-Z-Z-I-K-A-L. L if you foreign. And the reason really for that is that I want my physical files to be saved and restored before my logicals. So the space after the F sequences all my physicals before related logicals. These here are logical files that have the physical 110F as its parent. So FA, FB, FC, and FF all have 110F as a parent. And they fall logically into an order. As you can see, they don't necessarily need to be in alphabetical order, but they tend to end up that way. So it makes it for a nice, readable list where you have your logicals following your physicals. And if you look at AO, you will see that's exactly the way that the workbench is structured as well. So that is what I do. I keep my file names to 7 characters long because of my need to have triggers and constraints, using file name, underbar, and then some sort of an identifier. So if I make my file names longer than 7, then I have a problem trying to fit the file name into the trigger and constraint naming standard. Okay, so that is that. Programs, let's go back. I don't want to go programs. Well, let's have a look at the programs in my database first. Most of the programs in the database are triggers. And as you can see, the first 7 characters of the program name are the file name, and an underbar B0 indicates that it's a before trigger program. An A0 indicates it's an after trigger program. And those programs reside in the same database with my files. So that if I look at the view, you can see quite clearly, in RDI, you have the ability, let me see if I can put this in RDI. In RDI, you can sort by the name, and so if you scroll down here, you can see the physical file, SQL, the trigger programs, the IO servers, and the logical files all fit from there through to there. So you can see all the database components of file AOF 110 all together in a single list. And that's really where this naming standard came from. The dollar is the IO server, the underbar is the trigger. A B for before and A for after. And it actually falls very nicely and logically into place. In fact, I might as well use this for the others as well. However, when it comes to programs, application code, it's a slightly different scenario. Now, unfortunately, as I've told you before, my standards have tended to change over time. Again, I use either a 3 or 4 byte or character prefix to indicate in what group of programs this particular lot belong. DBWB is the database workbench. These are all DBWB programs are database workbench management programs. Here, DCT is the dictionary, so you've got these are the dictionary application programs. And of course, anything with a $$ at the end of it is a service program. Anything with a single @ sign in it is a module that gets bound into either a program or a service program, and so on and so forth. So you can see MSG. These are all message management applications. Here, SMD, structural metadata. This here is lib. It's got a $ in it. It means these are all modules. There's an there's an @ in it. There's an @ which is a service program, and there's a $, which is the binder source for that service program, which, by the way, is a CLLE, as we have discussed already. So I keep my naming conventions as short as possible, because I don't like typing long. And of course, system names are only maximum of 10 anyway. I'm just looking for some actual programs themselves. Here are programs, and you will see WBMNU, workbench menu. So this set of programs is to do with a workbench menu. There's D1, D2, D3. The D indicates there's a driver, and they are RPG programs. These programs fit around the user interface manager panels. That's a help, select. Okay, sorry, here's the driver for that menu panel. This is the general panel exit, which does the processing and everything else. There's the help text, it's a panel. There's the panel group, which defines the panel. So again, even though the naming convention might be a little bit rigid because of the user interface manager, you'll see again, WBMNU is the grouping. 01 is 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. I've got it in group. An underbar has a specific meaning. It's a panel group. Underbar D is the driver for that panel group, and so on and so forth. So they're very structured. W Workbench Management Services. There's the @ sign, which indicates they're modules. There's the double @ which indicates this is a service program, and so on and so on. And you will see this type of thing. Here is XCK. These are the cross-check application programs, which manage the cross-checks. These are RPG programs, which is cross-check processing of various types. You have a cross-check panel group and driver and every so often. So there's a very rigid left to right structure to my naming conventions. And the reason for it is that when I'm in RDI, I can pull down a subset. And I can then look for SMD, which is the structural metadata services. I want services for structural metadata, and I can subset that list on a left to right basis, and I get a list of all the program components, all the components that make up the structural metadata services. Notice they all exist in the same source file. That's why I have only a single source file, because in one glance I can see all the pieces. And you will notice the complete left to right standardization of the names. If I wanted to change that subset and I wanted to look at the structural metadata for libraries, I can pick those up and I've got a complete set. I can see their modules and that they're all bound together into a single service program called SMD libatat. So the naming standards that I use have changed over time. I'm getting better at it, but standards should be thought about carefully, I agree. They should be as consistent as you can possibly make them. And I have got in my files, it's a left to right grouping, 3 characters, 3 numbers, and an F. And then a letter if it's illogical. That has been standard with me forever. My trigger and constraint naming is completely standard. File name, underbar, and whatever else. Programs, I tend to group left to right, 3 or 4. Numbers, 2 numbers or 3 numbers, and additional indicators for the different types of program that I might be writing for my display files or so on and so forth. You need to get buy-in from the entire team for standards, because if you're going to introduce standards, you must, under all circumstances, okay, I've got another question. In fact, I've got a whole lot more questions. Kendall is sitting on a boat on a lake, but he's actually logged in. Can you believe that Kendall Anderlin is actually camping? He's sitting on a boat on a lake, and he's actually logged in.
I haven't really left yet.
Okay, you haven't gone away yet. I thought you were on a boat.
I am listening in from the iPad, though, so that's pretty cool.
Okay. Yeah, I tell you, technology is a wonderful thing. All right, so let's see what. Yeah, Dick asks, did the AODB library for database files contain IO server programs? Do both trigger programs and IO server programs reside in the database file library? My answer to that is generally yes, because they do form part of the entire database intelligence. And therefore, I like to keep them all together with their files in the database library. I may have different database libraries for different applications, but where the file is, so must the triggers and the IO servers be. In general terms, it's just to keep the database pieces together in one place. The exception to that rule is where you have what AO calls a shadow implementation. This applies to a lot of ISVs where they have an application running on a central system, very similar to the way Nathan and Kendall operate their environment. They have their application running on a central system, and they have a different library for every single customer. AO calls those shadow libraries. They should be exactly the same as the master library, but they are a shadow library, one for each customer. And in that case, what we do is we keep the IO servers and the triggers, which are common across all shadow libraries. We keep those in a separate library, which we call a database component library. Because you do not want to duplicate the IO servers and the trigger programs in 50 or 60 different libraries. You want to put them in a single database component library. So that's the circumstance in which I keep them in a separate library, so I don't have to duplicate the functionality. Right, Charlene. Did that answer your question, Dick?
Yep, good. It's what we plan on doing anyway, but I didn't see the IO server programs in your thing. I might have missed them.
Yeah, you probably did, because they were there. They're definitely there.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
And Charlene, what is the best alternative method to eliminate the use of logical files within programs? Do you mean by this, Charlene, that the reading of logical files inside programs? Ah, okay. Make an IO server for them. That's what I do. Every single file that I've got, whether it is physical or logical, has its own IO server. That means I can manipulate it. If it's a logical file and I don't want to allow people to update it, I don't include the update options. But it's still read in exactly the same way as all other files are read. And that, to me, is a very important process, is to try and create a very consistent environment that application developers can work in. That means it doesn't matter. If you write an IO server for your logical files and you write an IO server for your physical files, your application code looks and behaves exactly the same way. It may not be able to update the logicals, but it still can read them. And if you wanted to update a joined logical, you can allow the IO server to do that. We have discussed that. So what you need to do is you need to try and create an absolutely consistent environment. The other consideration with this whole thing is you want to actually decouple. This is a fancy word. You want to decouple the application code and the database. And the way to do that decoupling is to use IO servers. The IO servers handle the IO to the database, and the application uses the IO servers to do what it needs to do with the database on its behalf, so that you have consistent use, same standard parameters, whether the file is physical or logical. And in fact, eventually your application programmers don't know whether the file is actually a logical or physical unless they are familiar with the naming convention that you've used that identifies it. So that's the way. Some of our files have a lot of logicals. Is there any way to eliminate some of these logicals? Yes. And of course, if you can, I know where you're coming from. I was contracted by the South African Wheat Board at one point many years ago to teach them and to help with their application development and their database. And they had, I think it was 160 logical files on their customer master file. Their customer master file contained 30 fields. They had 160 logicals. Now, that is almost physically impossible. And we actually scrubbed nearly 100 duplicates. So that's the first thing you have to look for. Over a system that has evolved over time, a lot of duplicates get created because it's not easy. This is one of the things AO is designed to do, is to show you easily what logical files you've got and what keys and what select omits are in play, so that you don't just create a duplicate because you can't be bothered to look up what was available. So yes, see if you can find your duplicates. That's the most important thing. And remember, you can use the AO database files and write some SQL statements or some RPG statements to go looking for duplicates yourself. If the AO function doesn't exist, there's nothing to stop you using the data in the files to match them and have a look for the duplicates yourself. The other ways of doing it are to look for logical files that have the same keys but different select omits. There's a critical logical file, because if you read in blocks by key, if you've got a keyed logical file and you've got different select omits, you can actually include the select omits in your reads, and you can then get rid of a whole lot of logical files that are not necessary, because you can actually let the selects happen inside your IO server. So there are ways of getting rid of the logicals. When I do AO Inspector, which is a product you can all download if you want, it's from the website, and I'm taking you there right now because I need to show you something. If I can find it. Here it is, here. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. That was a silly thing to do. You need to get rid of your duplicate logicals. And why was I... No, this is the wrong... Yeah, that's the one I want. That's the one I was looking for. Yeah, the AO Inspector, that's what I was saying. The AO Inspector, which is in our website. If you go to downloads, you will find it there. Is the AO Inspector and its installation instructions. That allows you to examine your database schemas, and it produces a ratio, a physical to logical ratio, which in most cases is an average, but it helps me very often to understand what the database is actually doing and how well or badly people are using logical files. An average physical to logical file ratio for a reasonably normalized database of a mid sort of complexity will be between 1 to 4 and 1 to 7, i.e., on average, 7 logicals per physical. If your ratio is below 1 to 1, then you haven't got enough logicals, and what is happening means you are using I/O to access other files in your processing. So a ratio that is below 1 to 1 means you need to put more logicals into your system to make the processing of the database more efficient. So sorry, I'm just hearing a beep in my ear, so I'm checking to see who's who. So there's no right answer. You can have one file which is a critical transaction-based. Previously, where I worked was called a medical claim file. It was a huge file. It had numerous transactions, and it had 47 logicals on it. A lot of those logicals could have been squeezed out and combined. You can combine two logicals and you make a small change to one or two programs, and you can use one logical instead of three logicals. You need to look at the sequence of the keys. So there's no easy way to remove logicals. But on the other hand, getting rid of all your logicals is also not a good idea, because there's a performance issue in you want to prepare data and put data together so you're reading a single file instead of reading one file and then chaining across the database to collect all the other data. So there's a fine balance, and there's no right or wrong answer to that either. That is the problem. Okay. That was the last question. And I just want to show you a quick view of the AO website. We've got products, we've got services, we've got FAQs, and this is a forum where from the end of this session onwards, you need to post any questions. The reason is because questions that come to me on the email, I would then have to rewrite them into the FAQs. So we've got frequently asked questions. We've got a forum, which we would love for people to start using with regard to modernization and the AO product. We are trying to put articles that are related in here and so on and so forth. We also have a blog page, which at the moment is got very little in it. That's what I thought. I'm intending to start doing a regular blog on various tips and techniques of modernization and methodology, so that will also be something you can keep your eye on in the future. Here is the open source, where we will be publishing and posting all our open source offerings. Oh, okay. Maria says you've got to post to the forum, a question to the forum, which we will answer in the forum, and then if necessary, if we get it more regularly, we will move it to the FAQs. So that's the way around. Post your questions to the forum, and they might be moved later on to the FAQs. There are products, the various different products, the roadmap, the training, the AO Foundation, which is what we've seen a lot of, and AO Open, which is what the relational data 1-point portal is going to be called. So this is a good place for you now to begin chucking stuff at us. We're more than welcome to accept any questions, or the forum. You can discuss things amongst yourself. On the forum, you can open threads and so on and so forth. I think we are going to eventually get a link between this and our LinkedIn groups. Either we're going from here to the LinkedIn groups or from the LinkedIn groups to here. I'm not sure how this works. I'm an RPG specialist and not a blog or forum specialist, so I'm not sure how it works. But we're going to get a link between this and the LinkedIn groups, so you can follow us in either direction. So please, future questions into the forum. The open source will be published here. Keep an eye on it. And of course, all the downloads are here for AO and AO Inspector and all the other stuff. And that, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, in the forum, as Marina says, you could also put in requests for a blog. There's a particular topic that you want to see a bit more on. That's more on, not more on. Then let us know. We'll organize to have a blog published with that regard. So this brings us to the end Oh, Marina says, or if you want to write on the blog, you're welcome to do that too. So you can write us a blog telling us about your experiences maybe. And so that brings us to the end of a long session, really. It's been going on for quite some time. And basically, Perry said to me that he likes sunsets. So I thought this particular photograph was a rather appropriate ending to the whole string of sessions. I will put together a final PDF of all the PowerPoints, and we will publish that in the Dropbox. So you will have, I will add all the little bits here, put them onto the back of the PowerPoint, and you will have a complete PDF of the PowerPoints. And of course, you will have all the recordings. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention, your time, and your kindness. And I really, really hope you will take this by the horns, this bull by the horns, and go for it, because it's fun, and the results can be quite spectacular. So thank you very much, and hope we will talk again in the not too distant future.
Tommy.
Okay, it's a pleasure, guys. Kendall, go and have your holiday now.
Will do, as soon as I can get the kids packed up.
Okay, and have great fun.
Thanks, Tommy. It was enjoyable.
Pleasure, and
I'll keep in touch with you.
Please do. I don't know whether we're linked on LinkedIn, but if we're not, let's do that as well.
Okay.
All right. And we'll keep in touch.
Yep. Have a good night.
In fact, we'll probably be seeing a lot of each other.
Oh, okay. So you'll be working with us in the future then?
Well, one hopes so. That's the plan.
Right. Okay. That's good.
Marinas is talking to Michelle about it, so hopefully there will be some mutually beneficial arrangement come out of that.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks for all your time.
But please use the forum if you have any questions or anything.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Pleasure. Go well.